Welcome to Mental Stillness. My name is Derek, and I'm excited that somehow you stumbled across this podcast. One of my goals when starting this podcast was to bring mental health conversations into leadership circles. In today's episode, we are going to continue our conversation on various mental health topics. And as you saw in the title of this episode, today we are going to focus on depression. This is a topic that often causes confusion, but it is crucial to understand, especially the difference between depression and sadness. You see, on the surface, depression and sadness oftentimes can feel very similar, and they can be very confusing. However, part of the reason I wanted to do this episode was to help educate and show that they are, in fact, fundamentally different. They're different in almost every way, from their causes to the symptoms and the impact. And understanding these differences is vital for recognizing when we or someone we work with or someone we care about may need help. So I wanted to start with first talking about some definitions. Depression is defined as a mood disorder, and it's characterized by persistent negative feelings and changes in both thoughts and also behaviors. Now let's contrast that to our definition of sadness. Sadness is a natural and normal emotional response to stress or hurt. So for today's episode, we are going to contrast depression from sadness, and we will discuss how they are different. In the anxiety episode, I gave the disclaimer that there is nuance and complexity anytime you're talking about mental illness and mental disorders, and depression is one of the most complex. And what I find is that depression and anxiety are talked about so much that they almost feel simplistic. Here's what I find with depression and anxiety. They are words that everyone on the planet has heard, yet they are oftentimes extremely misunderstood. So you get these topics and these themes that everyone feels like they can define and everyone feels like they can explain. And I don't think that's an appropriate respect for just how complex anxiety and depression can be for people. If you know someone who's had a history of anxiety or depression, the last thing they would say is that it's been a simplistic experience. But in fact, it's been the opposite. It's been difficult. It's been dark. It's been layered. And so in today's episode, I want to give some general understandings just to help us put symptoms and experiences maybe in different categories. That maybe something we thought was depression, maybe it was actually sadness. And on the other hand, maybe something is a bit more clinical than I initially thought. Maybe I was attributing an experience or a season to sadness, but it actually dipped into clinical depression. And so I wanted to give that disclaimer before I jump into the different signs and symptoms and placing them in these different categories of sadness and depression. So I want you to think of sadness as strictly being emotional. Sadness is a natural and normal emotional response when we feel hurt or when we feel stressed. Some examples of this might be your best friend who's lived in the same city as you for your whole life gets a new job and they have to move across the country. Other examples of sadness might be missing a deadline, failing a test, or missing out on a promotion at work. It's completely natural and completely healthy for us to experience sadness if someone or something that we care deeply about is impacted. We actually should be more concerned if we did not experience sadness with these things. So sadness is strictly emotional, but I want you to think about depression as, yes, being emotional, but it's so much more. There's always physical symptoms attached to depression. Changes in appetite, weight, sleep disturbances, fatigue. These are all examples of how our physical bodies being negatively impacted alongside our emotions. With depression, there's also behavioral changes. Someone that normally loves to play piano, all of a sudden they find themselves walking past the piano in the living room each and every day, and they know in their head that there's a love for piano, but there is no motivation, there's no desire to actually sit down and actually play the piano. And so depression impacts us not strictly emotionally, but also physically and also behaviorally. That's a big contrast between depression and sadness. Sadness is a symptom of depression, but sadness alone is not considered a mental illness. Depression, on the other hand, is. Depression is a recognized and one of the most common mental illnesses. Sadness is typically more of a temporary emotional change. There might be a day or a week that's impacted with some kind of change, and as we are adjusting. But depression, it's more persistent. It doesn't come and go. It's not a one day here, a one day there. It's simply present. And there's often not a clear reason. Unlike sadness, which is temporary, depressive episodes can last months or even years. Most of the time with sadness, we can pinpoint what triggered that emotional change. Like I said, it's when my friend called me and let me know they were moving. That would be something we could pinpoint. Depression, though, is more vague. And when you talk to people who experience depression, oftentimes they cannot articulate or pinpoint why they are depressed. Depression is a bit more mysterious. And that's one of the most frustrating things about depression, is because cognitively, people can think certain things. They can believe in their head, I know I have a mom and dad who care about me. I know I have a good paying job. I know I'm on a softball team surrounded by friends and people who deeply care about me. But there's a disconnect from them emotionally feeling those things. And so this internal battle of what they know to be true in their head versus what they feel and experience and they embody, there's a disconnect, there's a dissonance. Another contrast is that sadness has short-term consequences. Maybe that's affecting your mood so much that you skip out on one or two social events, or you call off work. You get a little bit behind because you called off, but you get back to work, and in a week or so, you're kind of caught up, and overall functioning isn't impacted in an extreme way. But with depression, this affects every aspect of a person's life, and actually day-to-day functioning is impaired. Work, relationships, hygiene, these are all categories that are affected, and those are only to name a few. And so depression shows up in every single facet of people's lives. And again, because depression is going to impact the emotional, the behavioral, and the physical part of our lives. And so I wanted to give you a few next steps to consider if you're starting to see someone being deeply impacted by what appears to be depression. Number one, small tasks. One of the pillars of someone who may be experiencing depression is that they are in a state of overwhelm. One of the things you can try as a manager by taking these big, complex projects and simplifying those into the smaller parts. Is there a portion of the big project that you could coach them around and get them to focus on first, and give them permission to not have to spend the mental energy on those other parts of the big project? Hey, instead of focusing on A, B, C, and D this month, I really want to lean into A. What does it look like for us to plan and get some strategy in place for accomplishing A, and then next month we can move on to B? And the reason you want to do that as a manager is because when someone is depressed, their cognitive functioning is less. They don't have the ability to come up with some of those smaller projects. All they see is the big, scary A, B, C, and D have to get done. And it feels so big and scary, they don't know where to start, and so they don't start. And that just perpetuates the depression. So that's number one, smaller projects. The second thing I want to suggest is don't immediately go into fixer mode. without doing a bit of investigation. And what I mean by that is that you really want to start to figure out what is it that is actually meaningful and helpful to your employee. You might immediately go into fixer mode and you're like, you know what? Instead of having them come in at 8:30, I'm going to push that back to 10:30. I'm going to adjust their schedule. I'm going to give them some time. And that can come from such a genuine place of wanting to help. But the problem is if we don't include them in the plan, we might be setting them up for failure or perpetuating the depression. Because some people, the fact that they have to be somewhere at 8:30 is that nudge they need to actually get out of bed and to get moving for the day. And so it's actually beneficial for them to have that kind of structure. And so if we immediately go in and start changing some things without including them, we may not be helping as much as we think, or worst case, making things worse. And so similar to what we talked about with anxiety, you want to have a posture of curiosity, an entry point. If you're kind of stuck and you're like, well, how do I even bring this up, to then start asking them about what would be helpful. What I find is that thoughts and feelings are a bit more subjective, but when it comes to observing behaviors in somebody else, that's a little bit more objective. And so I feel like the behaviors can be a focal point for initiating this conversation. So the types of things that would be classified as behaviors might be how they're interacting with other coworkers. Hey, everybody went to lunch and you stayed back. Help me understand that. What was that about? Maybe it's in that meeting, we were talking about your area of the business and you just kind of sat there disengaged. Or maybe your team met the deadline and accomplished this major goal and everyone else was cheering and excited and you were just kind of there, but you didn't even seem to be that thrilled about it. All of these are examples of maybe some behaviors that you could use to start the conversation as you try to understand how to help this employee.